on a Sunday night. It was after church, and I was in the McDonald's drive-thru, no judgment. And I'm like, why is Tim Green calling me, right? And he basically asked me to make a couple $1,000 decision within 2 to 3 days. And I kind of fumbled on my words. I'm like, yeah, let's go. So I said, yeah, I'm in. I mean, who can pass up a tour of the Holy Land with someone who has given their life to learn these things? It's just to show up, but then for it to be narrated in that way is totally different. So I end up going, and we land in Tel Aviv. We arrive at our hotel, and the group of us are kind of having this small group discussion. The question that was posed and everyone was to answer was, what are your expectations for this week? When it came time for me to answer, I was like 9th, so I had a long time to answer. I thought to myself, I've heard all these stories my whole life, you know? I have all these imaginative memories in my head. It's like being a 7-year-old and listening to the librarian tell a story, and you're just forming it in your mind. But all the memories are just images and stories based on the story that I have heard. The funny thing about it is that even now, when I hear the same story from Scripture that I've heard 20 times in my life, I revisit the same imagination playback in my head. Sometimes when you hear Scriptures, you go back to the same thing that you have created in your head. It's what I've created for myself to help me live into the story and understand it. My answer to the question was, I don't want to tear that poster off the wall. I want to keep it. But I just want to put a new poster up next to it of what the actual reality is. There's nothing wrong with my imagination, but I am super interested to see the difference in the two posters. So, let's go to Mark 4:35. This is a lot. So if you just want to close your eyes and listen, that's great. If you're a visual learner, then it's on the screen too. We're going to go all the way through 5:20. Two stories that you may have separated before, but I want to pull them together. So Mark 4:35. On that day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat, so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And waking up, he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Be silent, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear, and they said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" They came to the other side of the sea, to the region of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man from the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke into pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the region. Now there on the hillside, a great herd of swine was feeding. And the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, stampeded down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. The swineherds ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus, and they saw the man possessed by demons sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the very man who had the legion, and they had become frightened. Those who had seen what had happened to the man possessed by demons and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged him that he might go with him. But Jesus refused and said, "Go home to your own people and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy he has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in all the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone was amazed. This is the word of the Lord. So in the beginning of Mark 4, which we did not read, Mark tells us that the crowds were continuing to grow surrounding Jesus. So he withdrew to the coast of the Sea of Galilee and sat in a boat. Am I doing something wrong with the mic? Does it sound like it's like I'm screaming into a cave? Okay. I didn't know if I was doing something wrong. Mark tells us that the crowds were continuing to grow surrounding Jesus. And so he withdrew to the coast of the Sea of Galilee and sat in a boat while the crowd sat on the shore to listen to him teach. He preaches to the crowd from the boat because they were pushing in on him. He tells the parable of the 4 soils, which Pastor Rich preached on 2 weeks ago, whereby a farmer sows seed onto all types of soils, some on the path, some on the rocky places, some among thorns, some among good soil. The word that the Father plants either takes root or it doesn't. Sometimes hardship overcomes the word that is planted in the heart. Jesus then talks about the mustard seed, a story, again, rooted in faith. Even the smallest amount of faith can grow into something so large, like a tree that gives rest to all creation. Amen. Mustard seed faith gives rest to creation. Remember, the crowds are pushing in on Jesus and his disciples, which is why they were in the boat in the first place. If Jesus had stepped foot back onto the shore, the crowds would have followed him wherever he went. They were good at that. When the sun begins to set, he looks at his disciples and says to them, "Let us go over to the other side." This picture is mine. I took it. I took this picture here from the shores of Capernaum. I imagine it being the perspective of a hillside listener facing Jesus sitting in a boat on the water teaching about faith. Have faith. Faith is like a mustard seed. Faith is like seed that falls on lots of soils. Faith, faith, faith. This is the reality poster. As a kid, I see my imaginative poster. It's still painted in my storied imagination. My understanding of the sea was like the Gulf of Mexico. It's the only big water I'd ever seen. When I hear this story, my mind tries to mold my understanding of vast sea water with something Middle Eastern. I see a dark night with the water at a similar temperament of the picture shown, but just as far as the eye could see. My whole life, I thought that the other side was nebulous. I thought the fear of going to the other side at night was rooted in the unknown. My imagination painted a picture that was almost like the kids from Sandlot. When a ball went to the other side of the fence, we're not sure what's over there, but we're positive it could kill us. When our tour bus came upon the Sea of Galilee, our tour guide said, "Funny story about the Sea of Galilee. It's not a sea at all. It's like a freshwater lake." Why do they call it that then? As we come around a corner, I look, and much to my surprise, I can see all of the corners of it. I can see every side. My imagination was wrong. The second that I saw the other side, my mind immediately went to Mark 4. What were they afraid of then? The disciples were sitting on the shores of Capernaum when Jesus said, "Let us go to the other side." I imagine them looking at each other with fear and disdain in response to what Jesus had just said, but none of them saying anything to Jesus. The other side? Like, the other side, the other side? Oh, okay, yeah. The other side. It's because it wasn't nebulous to them. They knew what was on the other side. They just weren't interested in going. The people of the Gerasenes were dirty people to them. It was a region filled with Gentiles, and the Jews wanted no part of them. I can imagine the disciples talking amongst themselves in the boat. Why do we have to go across the sea? Why can't we just go out into it for a while, wait for everybody to leave, and then just come back? I mean, why does Jesus want us to go to a place that could make us dirty? We're good Jews. Does he not care that they could kill us? Remember that. Does he not care that this might kill us? Meanwhile, Jesus, apparently exhausted from a full day's worth of teaching, he must have been an introvert. People rushing in on him. He's conked out in the stern of the boat when an intense storm begins to brew. Mark tells us in chapter 2 that at least 4 of his disciples are experienced fishermen. So storms on the Sea of Galilee are not new to them. They grew up here. This one, however, seemed to be a storm unlike the others. As they begin their skilled maneuvering to make sure that the boat hits the waves head on instead of coming from the side, and as they're treading water, trying to dump the water back into the pool from which it came, you got to imagine someone saying, "Where is Jesus? He's asleep. He's asleep. Well, go get him. I'm not going to get him. You get him." As the storm gets worse, their anxiety hits new heights, and their fear of death and destruction is rising. And finally, the fear and anxiety boils over for the disciples, apparently getting nowhere in their fight against the storm. "Jesus, don't you care if we die? How could you be sleeping? The boat is almost capsized 5 times. We're taking on water. It's only a matter of time until we all die. I knew we should have never come this far." With the boat still being tossed, Jesus does not respond to them, but instead he gets up and speaks to the storm as the rain and the wind pelt him in the face, and he says, "Be silent. Muzzle yourself." Then the storm is muzzled. I feel the boat slowly just rocking on the sea. I hear the silence broken at the sound of insignificant ripples hitting the side of the boat. Bloop. 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 I feel my sopping wet clothes. I hear the drops of excess water falling off the disciples' clothes. I see the drops falling from Jesus' drenched hair. I hear the exhausted, out of breath disciples trying to slow their breath. Imagine a standoff of disbelief, looking at each other in exhausted confusion. Everyone is soaking wet, including Jesus, trying to catch their balance. They were just moments from death. And now they're totally safe again. But at the hands of someone who apparently has so much power that the chaos of nature can be reordered in just 2 words. Jesus looks at them, drenched himself, and says, "Why are you so afraid?" Remember what just happened on the shore. Do you still have no faith? Do you not remember a single thing I said when we were on the shore? The rocky soil, the mustard seed. If you look quickly in the rearview mirror, Jesus says faith like a mustard seed grows into a massive tree with such big branches that creation can find rest in it. There's so much before and after this story that affects this story. Mustard seed kind of faith allows creation to rest. The disciples' faith seed falls on rocky soil. They immediately received it with joy, but they did not let it take root. And when trouble came, their faith quickly fell away. Even the slightest bit of faith, the size of a mustard seed, knowing that God in the flesh was with them in the boat, would have given rest to the hostile waters threatening to drown them. Jesus does what the disciples' faith should have done. He makes great calm out of great chaos. The text tells us that the disciples were terrified. I think I would be too. They were physically safe, but their fear moved from the power of the storm to the power of the one who the storm just listened to. Perhaps they thought, if his words are enough to end the life of a storm, can he do that to me? Their response to each other is, who is this? He just stopped a storm by talking to it. Our tour team took a boat to the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and Dr. Tim Green was reading through this scripture, to which his commentary at the end was, their question was certainly out of fear, but maybe it was one of the realest moments for them yet. Up until this moment, maybe Jesus was just a really good prophet. I mean, prophets did heal people. Prophets did perform miracles. But here, there's only ever been one who has told the chaos of creation to straighten up, and it listened. Their minds must have been in Genesis 1 when the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, and when he spoke, chaos muzzled itself. The question was also a declaration. There has only ever been one to do something like this. He must be Yahweh. When they land the boat, they're struck once again with a demon-possessed man wailing in a graveyard. It's one of my favorite stories. I'm sure they didn't want to get out of the boat. I mean, I certainly wouldn't, based on what I'd just been through, especially because I didn't want to come here in the first place, right? And oh yeah, we almost died in the storm of a lifetime. The demon-possessed man greets Jesus and immediately names him Son of Yahweh. The story of the Gerasene demoniac is a whole different sermon, but I put them together for this reason. The disciples are afraid of everything. Jesus is afraid of nothing. The disciples are afraid of the crowds in Capernaum, and they separate themselves. The disciples are afraid of the other side when Jesus gives the itinerary. The disciples are afraid of the storm. Then the storm stops, and they're afraid of Jesus. Then they hear the shrieks of the demoniac, and they're afraid of him. Definitely afraid when the demons begin to speak to Jesus and beg for mercy. But definitely terrified when Jesus sends the demons into a herd of 2,000 pigs. They all run off to the hillside, squealing into the Sea of Galilee. What a day. I would be afraid too. Through it all, though, Jesus is unfazed. I look back on my trip to Israel. Now all of my imaginative stories have a different poster next to them. I hold what I thought the circumstances were next to the actual context that I saw with my own eyes. It caused me to reread this story and not compartmentalize the scripture down to chapters and verses. Yeah, they're different stories. But when held together, they tell a much better and different story. The whole adventure is about faith. Admittedly, I'm not the guy that believes the devil is around every corner. I'm just not. Of course, evil is real, and it rears its ugly head around lots of corners. But if all I do is talk about the evil of the world and how quickly the world is going to hell, what is it that I really believe? Do I believe that the wind and the waves are actually gaining ground? Do I believe that Jesus, asleep on the cushion, is absolutely clueless about the state of affairs? Do I agree with the disciples and their frustration with Jesus? Do you even care if we die? Sometimes we talk more about the wind and the waves than we do the God that's in the boat with us. We're not an anti-evil people. Our call is not to rid the world of evil. Our call is to flood the world with the goodness of the one in the boat with us. The forces of darkness have tried for centuries to overcome the goodness of God. And to quote the Apostle John, the light shines in the darkness, but the darkness still has not even understood it. Darkness doesn't understand us. When we embody the character of God, darkness is so confused. We don't need strategies, political parties, opinions, or even denominations, even though I love the Church of the Nazarene. We don't need to hold our cross necklace out when we walk in hopes that darkness won't swallow us. We need faith. And not a faith that believes in God doing what I want for my life, because that may, in fact, be darkness. We need faith that holds to these stories. Stories that tell us that Jesus can order chaos, that Jesus desires for us to live, and stories that remind us when Jesus takes us to people who may make us dirty, he is making them clean in the process. Have faith in Jesus. Why are we so afraid? I don't think that the disciples were wrong for being afraid. I don't think it's wrong or sinful to be afraid, kind of like Dr. Boone said. It's a normal human emotion in response to what is happening in the world. In fact, it's healthy. You should be afraid of crossing busy traffic or putting your hand on a hot stove. It protects you. Being afraid is not wrong. However, if our fear is the thing we fixate on, then we aren't trusting the God who's holding it all. Yeah, the wind and the waves are scary. I get it. It's not wrong to be afraid of the wind and the waves. We are allowed to be afraid, but we mustn't forget that Jesus is in the boat with us. I would argue that the good news in this text is not that the wind and the waves are calmed, or that the crowds don't push in on the disciples, or that the disciples are not defiled by the region of the Gerasenes. The good news is that Jesus is with them every step of the way. Jesus muzzled the storm on the Sea of Galilee, but there have been many storms since then. Literal storms are terrifying, but so are figurative ones. Maybe your boat has almost capsized 5 times. Maybe you could feel the crowds pushing you into the water. Maybe you feel Jesus leading you to a place that you're afraid might make you dirty or ruin you. Maybe you find yourself asking the question the disciples did. Did you even hear me? Are you seriously sleeping? Do you even care if the waves crash in on me and throw me into the abyss? Maybe you're just this close to giving up and throwing yourself into the waves like Jonah did. You're allowed to be afraid. Do not repent of your fear. When you're soaking wet and shivering, just trying to keep your boat from sinking, don't forget who's in the stern. When the drowning water begins to fill your boat, and you start to wonder if this storm is going to be the end of you, remember that before the drowning water entered the boat, living water was unfazed in there the whole time. It's this simple. The forces of darkness cannot overcome the goodness of God. He is in the boat with us. And on our journey to the other side, when we get to the place that we may be terrified to go, Jesus steps out of the boat first, and darkness calls him by name and begs for mercy. The call for the Christian here is not to have no fear. Fears will always exist, especially in a world of unforeseen circumstances. The call for the Christian today is the same as the call that Jesus gave his disciples and his listeners before they left on the boat. Have faith that I am who I say I am, and that darkness has no power here. Guys, I am, is in the boat with us. I'm going to invite the worship team to come back. And as we sing and respond to this, it's possible. Yeah, come on. Yeah, it's all good. As we sing and respond to this, if you feel, if you start to feel your clothes are drenched because your boat is filling up with water, if you feel like the waves are crashing in on you, and it's so interesting because Pastor Rich just said this as he's praying, like, God, are you even hearing me? Do you even care? I mean, I don't know how to say this other than what I have just said, but yes. Yes, he does. And so if you want to come and pray as we sing, I think that this is a song that we have, or a message that we have to respond to. It may be prayer, it may be in singing. It may be in staying completely silent. But there's a movement in us. We have to respond. As we respond to this text, feel free to stand and sing, to come kneel and to pray. Respond in the way that you feel you should. The living water that is in the stern with us holds it all. He holds hummingbirds and gunshot wounds. He holds snowflakes and poor prognosis. He holds sunrises and orphans. The God of every heartbeat is in the boat with us. God holds every galaxy but every grain of sand. He speaks every language and hears every word. He holds deeper than the Pacific and higher than the stratosphere. And yet he feels every toss and turn in the waves, and he is drenched in the storm with us. The God who holds it all always holds you. The good news, friends, is not so much that the storm is muzzled. The good news is that the God who has the power to muzzle the wind and the waves is being tossed and drenched in the boat with us. Have faith that he meant it when he said it. He is with us always until the end of the age. Let's sing.